Hello again. This is Dr. John Roberts here for your Bi232 class, the Book of Acts. We will begin where we left off. We're just going to jump right into it because I have a lot of information here to finish covering for us today. The Book of Acts can be divided up into two acts of the apostles. Consider a stage presentation, like a stage show or some type of performance, and you would see two different types of acts, if you will, as far as the stage is concerned. The first act is going to be what we would call Operation Holy Land. Hint: this will probably be on your final. This is chapters 1 through 12. Again, this is Operation Holy Land. And this is chapters 1 through 12. And it is best understood as the Great Jerusalem Crusade. This crusade was headed up by Peter, the fisherman. Now, he was assisted by John, Stephen, and Philip. Their activities as a team, if you call it Team Holy Land, consisted of three diverse actions or activities. And those activities are I've taken the liberty of creating a table with the information and the scriptural reference to it. I will simply cover that here for us now. Under Peter, you would have what underneath him of what you would see him doing as far as part of the Holy Land Crusade or the Jerusalem Crusade. It would be the 120 that was led into Jerusalem for the receiving of the Pentecost. Then there was the Pentecost crowd. The 120 is chapter 1, verses 1 through 26. Then there's the Pentecost crowd. That is chapter 2, 1 through 47. Then we see an activity regarding a lame man. That's chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. Then there is the high priest that happened. The confrontation there is 4, 1 through 35. There is Ananias and Sapphira. This is chapter 5, 1 through 16. There is the lawyer Gamaliel. That would be chapter 5, 17 through 42. Then we would have Peter's interaction with Simon the sorcerer. Chapter 9, Dorcas, we will discover that in chapter 9 as well. Then there is Cornelius the centurion in chapter 10. Then we would discover Peter working with the legalizers in chapter 11. And then, of course, the angel of God in chapter 12. Under Stephen's activity within the Jerusalem Crusade, you would have seen him with the complaint of the Greeks. And then you would also have the conference of the 12. Both of those are in chapter 6. Along with chapter 6, you will have the choice of the 7. And then you will have the slander of the libertines, again, chapter 6. The sermon of Stephen in chapter 7, and of course, the stoning of Stephen, we will discover that in that relationship to Paul or Saul at the time. Then under the Jerusalem Crusade, there is the evangelist in the city of Samaria, okay? And then Philip the soul winner in the desert of Gaza, both of that in chapter 8. Again, that is the Operation Holy Land, which is also known as the Greater Jerusalem Crusade. Then there is the second act or the part 2 in Acts. Again, consider the whole stage presence, the whole stage situation in regards to a performance. And of course, that was Act 1, which was the Holy Land Crusade or the Jerusalem Crusade. Then we move into Act 2, and that would be Operation the Whole Earth. Okay, this is these are going to be the activities that are located in chapters 13 through 28. Quite extensive amount of them, but it is better understood as the gospel crusade. The first you have the Jerusalem crusade, now you have the gospel crusade, and that was going to be headed up by the apostle Paul, who he was a tent maker, Peter being a fisherman. He was assisted by Barnabas, Silas, Mark, Timothy, and Luke. Again, Luke is the one who is attributed for writing the book of Acts, and he certainly writes more detail in regards to the Gentile or the gospel crusade, more so than he did in Operation Holy Land or the Jerusalem crusade. So it's very probable that we see Luke being the firsthand witness to all of this. Now, what is the purpose of Acts? We can talk about all kinds of diverse things, but what would be the purpose of Acts? Now, we can find an accurate understanding of why it was written, is to give an account of the birth and the growth of the Christian church. Let me say it again. We can find an accurate understanding of why the book of Acts was written, and it was to give us an account of the birth and the growth of the Christian church. It is possible that Theophilus may have had some questions that needed to be answered after reading what Luke had wrote in the Gospels. And therefore, it is possible that Luke wanted to forthwith answer them, and thus the book of Acts was written. We can determine, because as I presented in the last segment, that it's possible that Theophilus was a Jewish rabbi. He was a Jewish priest, and because of such, he would be talking to Sadducees and stuff. And we can determine that Acts was purposed to not only bring forth the good news, but to reveal the action of that good news of salvation as it applies to everyone, and how the proof of the pudding is seen in the Gentile world, because the gospel message first came through the Jews. So we can see this interwoven relationship. Remember, Acts is a balancing act. Acts is a balancing podium that brings both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant to a balancing act. It's a buffering agent. Some other ideas that Luke may have had purposed into why he wrote it, it can be found in some different approaches. Now, I'm going to give these different approaches to you. I will tell you that these will be on your final exam, so pay very close attention. For example, of the different approaches, first one we're going to look at is historically. Historically, Luke, as being the good physician that he was, the physicians are accurate in their details. He wanted to present a careful summary of what he witnessed. We can find that answer, again, that a careful summary, that phrase, in Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 3, as to why he wrote the Gospel account. If Luke is the writer to Acts, then we certainly can see how he would want this careful summary to continue in the summarization of the action of the church. He obviously took great painstaking acts or challenges to verify these accounts, and that we have these recorded in this book. Now, apologetically speaking, now that's historically speaking, that is why one of the purpose or one of the approaches being historical approach, that he wanted to be accurate. In an apologetical approach, apologetically speaking, Luke would have wanted to present solidarity and evidentiary truth to prove the gospel account. In other words, he wanted to prove what was said in his gospel by showing the actions of what was spoken to the reality of the walking out what was spoken in truth. This gives us a better strength as followers of Christ and in our faith. There should and there would be have been the possibility that Luke wanted to reveal more things and more different approaches possible. Another possible approach to the why Acts was written was probably a conciliatory approach, or a conciliatory purpose. The early church contained two dominant factions. I've said it kind of before, or two dominant denominations, if you please: the Jewish believers and the Gentiles, the Gentile believers and the Jews. Paul had become the champion of reaching the Gentiles. Basically, he had been leading the charge on the Gentile front, while Peter led the charge on the Jewish front. It would be the council at Jerusalem that would discuss issues of the church in this divisional state, and they would, and during this this discussion, this meeting, if you please, they would seek to firmly resolve it. However, old ways certainly do die hard, and so the old issues would rise again and again. Each time, Paul would write to the churches of the day in seeking to diffuse the situation from potential harm to the family of God. The book of Acts is the happy medium. It's between both factions. That Acts brings this balance, okay? Where on one hand, the Jews are being led by Peter, and on the other hand, the Gentiles being led by Paul. And it is really the book of Acts, or Luke, who gives the balancing position of what he saw truth in both camps, if you please, and brings them together. He was able to see what he did, or what he witnessed when he was traveling with Paul. He certainly traveled with Peter before, and now he can see the balancing act between the two, and wrote this letter to Theophilus, who's probably a Sadducee, back in Jerusalem, or Antioch, or wherever he is at, to convey this truth so that he doesn't get confused. So that all this Jewish information that he has been presenting over the course, the Sadducee has been presenting over the course of time of him and the scribes, when Theophilus got this information, Theophilus could go to the Sadducees and simply say, hey, by the way, remember how all this was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah? Well, guess what, man? This is what it means right now, because it has come true. So Theophilus can basically become a lawyer for the Sadducees. So conciliatory speaking, we would see that this kind of this rise between each two, the Gentile versus the Gentile. Well, we all should be obeying the law. No, we don't have to obey the law anymore. God, through Christ, fulfilled the law. Well, we got to be circumcised. No, you ain't got to be circumcised. And this ongoing dispute between both factions, and Luke brings about the balance. Again, he witnessed both that with Peter and that with Paul, so he can see the truth of what is happening. Each aspects of both factions had their reality of truth, okay? But it is only and through Luke, in the writing of Acts, that we can see the balancing act portrayed, how one really can't exist without the other, and the other can't live without. You can't despise the other. You have to have this balancing act. In many ways, the church struggles even very much today with this very same issue. New believers need true encouragement, and non-believers need to know where the message of truth really is. The church needs to stop having petty wrangling parties of doctrinal arguments and unite around the core of the kingdom truth. The book of Acts is just that, and much, much, much more. Now, there are several journeys written inside the book of Acts, journeys, missionary trips, if you please, that is in existence, we read and see in the book of Acts. There are, as stated earlier, the book of Acts is like a blueprint, so to speak. In Peter's ministry, we see the journey of the church being established and the church being expanded. In Paul's ministry, we see his first mission, the council at Jerusalem between Peter and Paul. We see Paul's second mission, Paul's third mission, and then finally we see his trial in Rome, right? There are some cities, now speaking of Rome, there are some cities and places that we need to recognize in the book of Acts, and they're very, very not only interesting, but they are prominent in seeing how the church not only existed, but how it continued, okay? And then further, even beyond just the 38 years that the book of Acts covers. The first one, of course, is Judea. Jesus, now let me kind of give you some things here. Jesus ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olives, which is outside Jerusalem, and his followers returned to the city of Jerusalem to await the infilling of the Holy Spirit, which of course is the occasion called Pentecost. All of this happened in the land of Judea. Okay, Peter gave a powerful sermon that was heard by both Jews and Gentiles alike, and all across the vast empire of Rome. It would just be circulated, and all of this came out of Judea. The Jerusalem church then, however, grew, but it would be Stephen, or Stephen, however you want to pronounce it, who was martyred for his faith by Jewish leaders who did not believe in Jesus. Okay, so all that happened and transpired in Judea. All right, then we have another town or another place called Samaria. Now, Samaria, after Stephen's death, the persecution of the Christians intensified, and it caused the believers to leave Jerusalem and spread the gospel to the other cities throughout the empire of Rome. Philip would have taken the gospel to Samaria, and even to a man from Ethiopia. This would happen in Samaria. And then, of course, now it would reach out to another town called Syria. Paul, or Saul, began his story as a persecutor of Christians, only to be met with Jesus himself, who on the road to Damascus became a believer. Paul, or at that now becomes, but Saul, he put his faith, his faith that he had before as Saul into the law, met with great opposition to his life. And so he returned to Tarsus, that's where Saul was from, the Saul of Tarsus, or Paul now, his home, and he would return there for safety. And later, Barnabas would seek out Paul in Tarsus and would bring him to the church in Antioch, and all of this in Tarsus, of course, where Barnabas and him worked together. All of this happened in the land called Syria. Peter would also receive a vision in Syria, more precisely Caesarea, the name of the town, where he was presented the gospel to a Gentile family who would later become believers. And all that happened in Syria. Now, there is a passage of scripture that says that this good news will be taken first in Jerusalem, and then in Judea, then Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. That passage of scripture that was spoken is a prophetic word that we actually see right here in front of us. Jerusalem, and then in Judea, which is the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem, and then into Samaria, which is across the ways, where a lot of the Jews have, those are the cousins, not really. The Samaritans were Jews, but they were distant cousins. And so The Samaritans would have their aspects of living a Jewish life. So God would say that the gospel of Christ would be first preached to Jerusalem, and then into Judea, and then into Samaria, and then into the uttermost parts of the world. And this is exactly how it transpired, the first part or the book of Acts. Okay. Now, after Syria, of course, we're still speaking about the uttermost parts of the world. There's another place called Cyprus and another place called Galatia. Paul and Barnabas would be so dedicated in their focus of the church and to Christ that they would dedicated by the church of Antioch of Syria for God's work in spreading the good news to other cities, including these two places, Cyprus and Galatia. They, in fact, would take their first missionary journey through that part of the world. After that, of course, remember, it's the town of Jerusalem. I just want to kind of go back over. Jerusalem, there's a controversy between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians over the matter of keeping the law. And so they met with having a special council with delegates from the churches of Antioch and the church at Jerusalem. And they met in Jerusalem, and they used their meeting place or their time to rectify this conflict that rose up. Now, as Paul and Barnabas went out further, and then of course they got into Cyprus and Galatia. The reason why I'm coming back to Jerusalem, because it was growing and exactly happened in the way God wanted to happen. But then you had the Jerusalem account or the Jerusalem mission going on, or the Jerusalem crusade, the Holy Land crusade, going on and just going on and just building right there in Jerusalem. It's just building right there, not escaping anything, staying in Jerusalem. But the gospel is going all the way out. And so God brings these men together at the city to which it started, the birthplace of the church, to discuss further the implications that has been raised and the impact that the gospel message has done for the church and for the kingdom of God. So Jerusalem becomes, again, a center focal point, but they resolve the issue of realizing that what the old covenant is and what the new covenant is. And again, it's Luke who's among this crowd that brings this balance, and he writes about it. That's why we're reading the book of Acts. Then there is a place called Macedonia. Macedonia is a place where Barnabas traveled to. Remember, Barnabas traveled to Cyprus, while Paul took a second missionary journey where he visited the churches in Galatia. Okay, so you got Paul and Barnabas, Cyprus and Galatia going on, and they were heading towards Ephesus. Paul was heading towards Ephesus when God told him no. And then Paul turned northward and was fixing to go to a place called Bithynia and Pontus. And once again, God told him no. And then God called him to go to Macedonia and follow his direction into the cities there in that land. So Macedonia is now going to be impacted by the good news of the gospel. Then there's Achaia. Paul would travel from Macedonia to Athens and Corinth, and this is the land of Achaia. Then traveled to Ephesus by ship now. From there, he would return to Jerusalem and Caesarea and again to Antioch. Another town of which is important into the book of Acts is, of course, we see it many times over. And in fact, it's this land that we would see where the unity of Christ is so being preached and being compelled to be preached that when Paul would write to the churches at Ephesus, he would talk about being unified and being in oneness. He would just compound them ongoing, continually, to the purpose, and that's being this um, this unity message. And it's in Ephesus is where we see this land of Ephesus. The third missionary trip that would journey Paul back to Cilicia and Cilicia, and Galatia. However, this time he went straight to Ephesus in Asia before going back to Macedonia and to Achaia. He would return via ship to Jerusalem despite his knowledge that his arrest was awaiting him. So while all this was going on, Paul had this, he had some legal issues brewing. Yet that didn't damper Paul. He continued on. And when he gets to Ephesus, all of a sudden it's the unity message that we see. And you can study in the book of Ephesians to find more about the unity of Christ and the unity of the body of believers. Now, there's also the place called Caesarea. Paul would be arrested in Jerusalem, okay? He would then be taken to Antipatris. Antipatris then to Caesarea under Roman guard. More so, Paul would take advantage of any opportunity to share the gospel wherever he was at. And he did so before many Gentiles and their leaders. Because Paul appealed to Caesar, he began his long journey back to Rome. Paul knows the legalities, and so he's going to take that legality situation at hand, and he wants to appeal his case to Caesar. And so that means he's got to journey this quest, and this becomes this more part of his missionary journey. And then when he gets to Rome, after the great severe storms that we read about, that we're going to read about, the layovers in Crete, and even his shipwreck event that happened on the island of Malta, Paul would finally arrive in Sicily, in Italy, to await his long-awaited destination, Rome, the very capital of the empire. It is there that we begin to see what Paul and his quest would be, because we have the book of Romans. Well, that's him going to Rome. The book of Ephesians, the Colossians, Philippians, all these diverse places. We're going to find this out as we read and study through the book of Acts, and it's going to start blending all these other books that you see, or the other letters that was written by these guys, and we're going to see how all this kind of fits into play. But it's the book of Acts that just is the glue between the old and the new. All right. I have taken the liberty of putting into your notes on this particular week 2 maps. One of which is the map where I've given you a broad sense or an overview of Europe and Asia through this region, Northern Africa, the parts of India, Egypt, all of this throughout this area. And the things that I'm speaking of, the towns and the places that I'm talking of, I wanted you to kind of get a better feel for what the words that I'm using, the names of the places that I'm telling you and teaching you about, because I want you to see pretty much where this circumference is happening, what the arena or the area that we're talking about. On the second map, however, I am showing you the journey or the final mission or the final missionary journey of Paul. And the reason why I do that is because I want you to see how far his journey extenuated. And all the more reason that you could understand, because remember, but they don't have motorized equipment, boats and such like what we have now. So their journeys was traveled through sailboats and ships with oars. These were how they traveled far distances. And you will see on the second map just how far it is, and really would kind of bring a reality check, or it should, to show us how far this is, because this consists of 38 years of what we're seeing on this missionary journey. We will see how he, why it took so long, because that's just, it is what it is back in that day. All right. Let's continue as we read or we study more about the background of Acts. We can review the backgrounds of both Peter and Paul. Okay, when I speak of backgrounds, I'm talking about the people now. We can review Peter's anytime. Peter was in the gospel message, and that's certainly important. I'm not certainly going to deviate or say it's not important, because it is. It would benefit you to take a time to study on your own about Peter, where he come from, the land he was noted from, his journey, what and how he became who he became, and you can very much see his even in his sermon we're going to study here next week. We will see how and why he really is who he is. So we will cover that. But for now, I want to kind of focus a little bit on Paul. Of course, Peter's background, he was a fisherman. Okay. But going back to the gospel again, you can study more about Peter. So this right now, we're going to look at Paul. Paul, because to understand him, because it sort of kind of begins with him in a fashion, not like at the very beginning, but the beginning of Paul's life. Paul was one who was a persecutor of Christians, and then in the end, he is the one that is a person who pleads the cases for Christianity. So Paul is, of course, now Luke is writing. Luke is traveling with Paul, so it would be more, again, makes sense why Luke would be the writer, because he certainly covers more of Paul's journey than he does Peter's journey. But we would need to understand a little bit more about Paul, because it's going to help us to understand what the writer, or Luke, is trying to portray for us. Paul, he was really Saul of Tarsus, the land of Tarsus. Look on your map that I've given you, and you can see where Tarsus is at. Now, there's some vital statistics, concerning his early life. And again, I want to meet with future dialogue, so I'm going to cover that here in regarding Paul. His early background, his ancestry, and his youth are that he was born and raised in Tarsus. You can see that in Acts chapter 21 and 39. Tarsus was a Greco-Roman city in Cilicia. It's modern-day Turkey. It is the crossroads of Asia Minor, okay? It's at the heart at these crossroads, where trade and religion and different ideas converged all at the same point. It is in Tarsus that we see this conglomeracy of ideology, religion even, begins to come into focus here in Tarsus. It was, at that time, a province of Rome. In other words, it was Roman occupied. Rome conquered that land, and Rome, the emperor, was overseeing, or the ruler over that land. It was the Roman emperor's land. Although he was of Jewish descent, this is what makes him a Roman citizen, is by being from Tarsus. Okay. He was born a Jew into and from the tribe of Benjamin. You can see this in Romans chapter 11, verse 1. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, Philippians 3 and 5. His education consisted from being taught by Gamaliel. He was a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. Gamaliel is in Acts 22:3, and him being a Hebrew of Hebrews is Philippians 3 and 5. His education, it consisted from being taught, of course, by Gamaliel, but again, Pharisees, were taught the law. So he began to become characterized by the legality of the law, the Pharisaic law. His character in the early years, he was an uninformed blasphemer. You can read that in 1 Timothy 1 and 13. Saul displayed, and when he was Saul, great zeal in attempting to keep the law, Philippians 3 and 6. And he displayed great zeal in attempting to destroy the church. And you can see that, of course, in 3:6 of Philippians. Now, he held and led a war, almost a private war, against the church very early on. It is no wonder that Peter and him clashed when he was Saul and not Paul. Saul took part, in the death of Stephen. You can find that in Acts chapter 7 and chapter 8. Saul beat Christians in Acts 22. We're told of that. He made havoc in the early church in Acts 8 and threw Christians into prison. He hounded them to their very death. We can see that in Acts 22:4. Saul voted to even put them Christians through all kinds of torture to cause them to blaspheme. And you find that in Acts 26:11. He also persecuted the church beyond measure, and he wasted so much of his early life. We find that in his letter to the church in Galatia. His conversion, however, is referenced in Acts chapter 9, chapter 22, 26, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and 1 Timothy chapter 1. All these accounts detail how en route to Damascus he was to persecute believers, and how he was knocked down and was blinded by a heavenly light. He then heard and accepted Christ as Lord and Savior. He then was led to Damascus, where he remained alone for 3 days and was ministered to by a believer there named Ananias. He then received his eyesight back and then preached Christ in the synagogues. Paul's early ministry then, he went from Saul to Paul. His early ministry consisted of his preaching Christ in the synagogues in Damascus. That's in Acts chapter 9. Paul then would escape from Damascus and visit Jerusalem for the first time since his conversion. That's also spoken of in Galatians chapter 1. He would return to Damascus with greater knowledge and preaching power. Acts chapter 9 again. Paul was then sent to Tarsus to escape a Jewish plot on his life. He would retire to the Arabian desert for a period, several years, in fact. We find that in Galatians chapter 1. And he would be brought down to help out in Antioch by Barnabas. He visited Jerusalem a second time, bringing a love offering to the needy there. That's interesting. He went from, despise you, want to kill you, to bringing love and doing something to help you out. Finally, we see him retiring to Antioch to preach and to teach the word of God. That's in Acts chapter 12. We'll get there soon enough. Now, all this is to understand, Paul and all that he would go through, and it's really going to give us a more fundamental reality when we see chapters 13 through 28, okay? I just wanted to go over that because, again, and I believe that Luke is the writer of Acts and, of course, of Luke. And Luke, who traveled with Paul, is going to deliver more information regarding the apostle Paul and even help to convey that information that he witnessed along Paul's side to Theophilus, who I believe is a Sadducee or a Jewish priest that's able to talk to Sadducees, and he is going to be able to convey the reality of what God did through the Jewish world to impact a Gentile nation to overcome the sin that was in the world through and through. And so that is pretty much in a nutshell what we see happening in regards to Paul. And we will cover that in week 3. We'll get that pretty close and pretty quick. So just hold on to your spiritual chairs there. Get your Holy Ghost spiritual seatbelt on. We'll get there soon enough. Next, I want to talk about other events that transpired around the world. Now, I'm going to list these in chronological order. I want to read them to you. Now, I haven't studied such historical values myself. I did read through them, and I have studied over them and glimpsed through them and many times over. But I do feel like they are important to our understanding of the book of Acts, because it's important to see what God is setting up. It's important to see that God is building up within us a church to go out and impact the world. But it's really interesting to see what's going on out in the world and to see how God is building this up so that when these two entities collide, that the church and the blood of Christ will overcome the world because God said it would happen. Now, so around the world, there are several events that were taking place and shaping up while Acts is conveying the 38 years. All right. They are now. I want to begin with 25 A.D. In 25 A.D., we have the Han Dynasty being founded. There was this guy by the name of Wang Mang. I know it sounds kind of funny, but after his death, Hu Han founded the Eastern Han or Han Dynasty. And it was during the Han Dynasty, which lasted until about 220 AD, that Buddhism was introduced into that part of the world. This is when Buddhism is beginning to is taking shape and is beginning itself also as a religion. That is in 25 AD, all the way up to 220 AD. We have in 32 AD, of course, Jesus Christ was put to death by the Romans in Jerusalem, approximately about April the 7th. Okay. I don't want to go into the reason why I come up with those dates. If you ask me privately, I'll be glad to tell you. But in about April 7th, in 32 AD, Jesus Christ would be put to death by the Romans there in Jerusalem. In 41 AD, Caligula was assassinated. After the death of Tiberius, he was succeeded by Caligula. He was considered by many to be insane. He was assassinated by Cassius, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, Sharia. He was a member of the Praetorian Guard on January 24th of 41 AD. In 51 AD, this is when the conquest of Wales was accomplished by the Romans. The Romans under Ostorius Scapula defeated Cardicus of Wales. This eventually would lead to the complete subjugation of Wales to the Romans, and it would take 20 years for that to happen. So about 71 AD, Wales would be totally, or that land would be totally under Roman subjugation. That is also the time when Jerusalem would be falling, but we haven't got there yet. We're only talking about 51 AD. 54 AD, Claudius was assassinated by his wife, Agrippa. I'm sure you probably heard of this in your history lessons, maybe, using poisonous mushrooms. Agrippa then arranged for her son Nero, now check this out, to become the emperor of Rome. Later, Nero would eventually have his mother killed. Nero wasn't a very cool kid at all. That's 54 AD. In 66 AD, 12 years later, Judea would rebel against Rome. Okay. It would be 66 AD. Judea would rebel, the land of Judea, Jerusalem, and remember, it's in Judea. And then Judea would rebel against Rome, and that rebellion broke out in the city of Jerusalem against the Roman rule, the occupation of Rome. And the Roman fortress of Antonia in Jerusalem was then captured, and the soldiers there were killed. The Romans then dispatched an army from Syria to quell the revolt, but it was destroyed on its way to Jerusalem. And that was 66 AD. 2 years later, in 68 AD, this was the year which is known for as being the time of the four emperors. In 69 AD, it's known as the year of the four emperors for sure. Nero would be assassinated, okay? And a civil war then, therefore, broke out due because of Nero's death. A civil war would erupt to determine who would be the successor, okay? And in that course of that year, in that 68 AD, of course, Nero was succeeded by Galba, who was followed by another one by an emperor by the name of Otho. Otho was defeated by Vitellius, and the Vespasian finally would establish himself a new dynasty. Vespasian was the son of a tax collector from Rete, is the name of that place. He represented a complete break with the Augustine dynasties which preceded him. And this combined would be the time known as the time of the four emperors. And then, of course, in 70 AD, Jerusalem would fall. Rome sent an enormous army under the campaign that in command of Vespasian, I'll get it out here in a minute, to retake Judea. The Roman army then quickly subdued the Jewish forces in the Galilee region and laid siege at that time to Jerusalem. Vespasian was recalled back to Rome, and the siege continued by his son Titus. Titus then succeeded in actually capturing Jerusalem on the 9th day of Ab, according to the Jewish calendar, and he burned Jerusalem, killing or selling into slavery tens, if not thousands, of Jews. And that is what is happening during the course and time of the 38 years that we see Acts, the act or the actions or the things that took place during those times that Luke would later write in about 63, 65 AD. This is all a historical value and concept to gathering a more precise evaluation of the book of Acts. These are statistics that I've gathered for you to help you understand kind of what Acts is circumventing, what's surrounding it. That being said, I highly recommend that the rest of this time until you pick up on the next week, which would be week 2.1. So from now to then, we'll give you about 4 days, 5 days. Take the time at least read chapters 1 through 12. If you don't read the whole thing, that'd be wonderful if you did, because the more you read it, the more it's all going to start fitting and making sense to you. But definitely read before we come back together on week 2, that you read chapters 1 through 12. Well, that sounds like a lot, Dr. Roberts. No, it's not a lot. It's really not a lot. I mean, I bet you read magazines and stuff a whole lot more than you do what this is. So read chapters 1 through 12 before you pick up on week 2.1. And that is where we will pick up on the life and the mission of Peter which is also called Operation Holy Land, and the Greater Jerusalem Crusade. Going back to your syllabus, give me a second here. Going back to your syllabus, we will take up again Peter's ministry on all three of those. We're going to cover all 12 of those chapters over the 3-hour course. So we'll have chapters 1 through 4, and then the next, and then the next 4, the next 4. So you will have a really good balance understanding of the book of Acts when we get through Peter's position. Bear in mind that if some I've already got emails from saying that you're having issues because of your bandwidth, not being able to watch the videos. I certainly am putting out the information on our notes. So of course, my finals, the final that I give in this class will be taken directly from the notes. So that way there's no reason why you can't attempt to answer the questions. I do know in some cases that if you don't think you understand the question, you just don't answer it. Let me say this, answer it anyway. If you're not going to answer it, you're going to get it wrong. So why not give it a shot to gather what you have learned, or at least look into the notes, because that's exactly where I'm going to get the test from. I do want to kind of go over a chronological order of things. This is not in the notes, but I will have it into the next notes for sure. I'm going to read to you the chronological order of what we see from the beginning to what we see in the end, okay, and date stamp it for you. So approximately AD 30, somewhere in there, AD 33, 32, Jesus was crucified, Pentecost, and the church would be birthed and would begin. Approximately 35 AD, Stephen, however you say it, would be martyred, and Paul's conversion would soon there take place. In 38 AD, we will see Paul returning to Tarsus. In 43 AD, Barnabas will go in search of and to find Paul. In 44 AD, James would be martyred. Yes, the Apostle James. And then Peter would be put in prison. That's 44 AD. In 46 to 48 AD is Paul's first missionary journey. In 50 AD will be the council or the meet, or what they call the Jerusalem Council to meet. For the next 2 years after that, you will have Paul's second missionary journey. And then in 53 AD to 57 AD, we will discover Paul's third missionary journey. In 54 AD, remember, this is when Nero would become emperor. In 57 to 59 AD, Paul would be imprisoned in Caesarea. In 59 AD, Paul would journey to Rome. In 62 AD, Paul would be released from prison. In 67, somewhere in there, Paul would be martyred. It's not exactly for sure when that would take place, but it's approximately given the date of 67 AD. We will get that in week 4. And of course, in 70 AD, we will find and discover Rome being destroyed. Or excuse me, I'm sorry, Jerusalem being destroyed by Rome. Forgive me. So that is pretty much in a nutshell what we have covered this week. Next week, we will begin again, like I said, into Peter's ministry, if you will, the Jerusalem Crusade. So thank you for for coming and watching this. So make sure that you hit the like button and certainly subscribe to the channel, Acts of the Apostles, and we will begin learning more about the Acts of the Apostles. Okay? God bless you. Have a good day.